Okay, so I think let's get started. Good afternoon, colleagues. It's wonderful to introduce our speaker for today's departmental forum. Professor William Hersh of Bill is a professor in the Department of Medical Informatics and Clinical Epidemiology in the School of Medicine at Oregon Health and Science University in Portland, Oregon. He has served as the inaugural chair of the department from 2003 to 2022 and remains a professor in the department. He is a global leader and innovator in biomedical and health informatics and one of the key global leaders in this area. His research focuses on the application of information retrieval techniques to electronic health record data, aiming to improve patient cohort discovery and amplification of signal of rare diseases. Bill is going to speak to us today about biomedical and health informatics, an essential discipline for the 21st century medicine. Bill, over to you. We look forward to your lecture.
Thank you, Nabeko. And I really appreciate the, I'm really honored to present to the Department of Medicine at the University of Cape Town. My background actually is originally in internal medicine, though I have spent most of my career working in informatics. And I've had some longstanding collaborations with UCT that are ongoing. I'll talk a little bit about towards the end of my talk. I hope this might be a beginning of exploring other ways that we can work together. I will be talking today about the field whose overarching name is biomedical and health informatics, and the importance of this discipline for medicine in the 21st century. You see a picture of my institution here, which is up on a hill and has an aerial tram. So if any of you are ever here in Portland, Oregon, I'd love to show you around. So basically, I will talk today to really answer several questions. First, what I'll abbreviate, biomedical and health informatics? What has it accomplished? Where are some of the areas where it's fallen short? Some comments about the people who work in the field and how one might learn more about the field, including in Africa and including through the collaboration that we've now established. I get asked this question often, maybe not as often as I used to get asked it, but what is biomedical and health informatics? And also, by the way, I will be happy to share these slides. In fact, I have a PDF that also has all the references that I cite, and I've actually posted it on my website, and I'll be happy to send it along. I do maintain a website just because people ask me this question, so it delves into some detail, including having some lectures from the introductory course that I teach. I also maintain a blog about the field, and I'm also the editor of a textbook that was started by a colleague of mine, Robert Hoyt, and I have now assumed the editorship. But basically, the way I define the field is that it's concerned with the optimal use of information, often aided by technology, to improve individual health, healthcare, public health, and biomedical research. So really the focus is more on the information than the technology. Obviously, you need good technology, and probably those of us who work in informatics are enthusiasts about technology. But really the focus is on information and what it can do to improve healthcare and public health. There are some other definitions of the field that I think bring out some important points. The American Medical Informatics Association, AMIA, describes informatics as the interdisciplinary field that studies and pursues the effective uses of biomedical data, information, and knowledge for scientific inquiry, problem solving, and decision making, motivated by efforts to improve human health. So again, this aspect of human health being a core part of what informatics does. The Accreditation Council for Graduate Medical Education, ACGME, which actually accredits programs in clinical informatics, which is now a subspecialty of all specialties here in the US. I'll talk about that more. But I also like their definition that states the field transforms healthcare by analyzing, designing, implementing, and evaluating information and communication systems to improve patient care, enhance access to care, advance individual and population health outcomes, and strengthen the clinician-patient relationship. That's what we try to do. We don't always succeed, and I'll talk about that a little bit as well. There are some additional perspectives. On the left is this Venn diagram from some colleagues at the State University of New York, Buffalo, that note that informatics is this intersection of people, information, and technology. So it combines all three of these, not one individually. The Institute of Medicine in the US has published about the core competencies for health professionals, and informatics is one of those key aspects of that enable the provision of patient-centered care. And there's also the so-called fundamental theorem of informatics coined by my colleague Charles Friedman, who notes that our goal is to result in the upper figure of the human plus the computer aiming to be better than the human alone, rather than the computer trying to replace the human. Now, we don't always succeed with computers in making humans better, but that's what we aspire to do in informatics. Sometimes you'll hear some other terms related to informatics, some what I call sub areas. In fact, sometimes I joke that we have an adjective problem in informatics because, for example, I'm saying biomedical and health informatics. You all have probably heard terms like bioinformatics, clinical informatics, et cetera. So let me distinguish these terms. Bioinformatics, and I have some great bioinformatics colleagues at UCT, who I'll mention later on. It really tends to be focused on cellular and molecular biology, all of the omes and omics, the genome, the proteome, the microbiome, et cetera, and all of the data around gene sequences, protein structures, things like that is the major work of bioinformatics. Of course, that crosses over into other areas. Clinical informatics is the term that we use to really describe what clinicians, including physicians, do, and with its focus on healthcare. And it's also the name of the physician subspecialty in the US. There's also the term public health informatics, which is the informatics that's focused on public health. Obviously, that's been a big area in the past few years with the pandemic and so forth. And then another area of growing importance is clinical research informatics, how we manage all the research data, including data that comes from operational information systems, such as the electronic health record. And so that's another important area of informatics. Now, part of the early work of the field focused on medical decision-making and artificial intelligence, although not the AI as we know it in modern times. But the early AI, again, was a big focus of informatics. And in fact, some attribute the earliest paper in the field to one by Ledley and Lusted, published in 1959, that aimed to model the way that physicians reason through symbolic logic, so meaning symbols that represent diseases and treatments and symptoms and things like that, and then probabilities. And a lot of work that went on in the early days of AI in the 1960s tried to, for example, develop mathematical models for diagnosing various diseases, such as Homer-Warner, the initial model around congenital heart disease. And this led to the development of what were called at the time expert systems that were basically computer programs that aimed to mimic human expertise. And one of the early leaders in this area was Ted Shortliff, who remains a leader in the field. And his PhD dissertation built a rule-based system where basically there were manual construction of literally hundreds of rules just for single diagnoses like sepsis and endocarditis, things like that. And then this was expanded out to other areas. But building all these rules was very time consuming, and it really was not a scalable approach. So others developed systems using disease profiles and scoring algorithms, some well-known systems from the 1980s, Internist 1 and DXplain. But this whole era had two problems. One problem was that the goal was trying to build computers that essentially replace the human diagnostician. And a famous paper about the demise of the Greek oracle stating that we really need to focus on supporting clinicians and not replacing them. But probably a bigger problem was just the fact that all these knowledge resources, knowledge bases were manually constructed. They were difficult to maintain. Computers of that era were a lot less powerful. And all of AI in general entered what some call the AI winter. And we almost completely stopped talking about AI through the 1990s and into the early 21st century. Although some things did survive. For example, the clinical decision support that we see in electronic health record systems has continued on. But it's a very limited application, and it really isn't AI as much as it is just firing rules to notify physicians about drug-drug interactions or reminding them to order screening tests or things like that when you prescribe a drug to check the kidney function, things like that. Another early focus of the informatics field was developing electronic health records. I know that in Africa, there's not as widespread use of electronic health records yet. I suspect that will change over time. And I show you a screen here from the system from the Veterans Administration, which is one of the leaders in the US in terms of developing electronic health records. In the early days, various academic institutions developed their own so-called homegrown electronic health records, but now most of those have been replaced by commercial systems. And as many of you may know, the two big leaders are the US companies Epic and Cerner, and they also are now starting to see use in other countries, though there are plenty of other systems. And electronic health records, for the most part, and in fact, some say this is one of their limitations, they essentially mimic the paper record. Here you see, in essence, a cover sheet that has the problem list, allergies, some reminders, recent lab tests, appointments, and so forth. And you see the tabs at the bottom that let you drill down more into the individual data. Another important early development and continues to be important in informatics is the role of the US National Library of Medicine, which is part of the US National Institutes of Health. The NLM is the world's medical library, and was led for a long time by Dr. Donald Lindbergh, who stepped down in 2016 and passed the torch to Dr. Patricia Brennan, who's now the director of the National Library of Medicine. And the NLM developed many of the bibliographic databases that can be accessed from all over the world. And I suspect probably many of you use these resources. Many of you may also go back as my early time as a physician using the Index Medicus books that used to be available in the library before we had search systems that everyone could use. But those have all been replaced now by electronic means, and in particular PubMed, which is the main National Library of Medicine interface to the biomedical literature. And the NLM does a lot more than just PubMed. They facilitate access to the full text of scientific literature, though a lot of that is still commercial and produced by publishers. So if you find something in PubMed, you may encounter a paywall when you try to get to it. And there's actually a lot of efforts going on in the US to make the biomedical literature more accessible, especially since the taxpayers of the United States pay for a lot of that research that is funded by the National Institutes of Health. But it's the NLM's work is not limited to literature. They've been leaders in the various omics databases. So GenBank, which has all the nucleotide sequences, protein databases. There's now databases being developed that have genetic.
So we've got how many biopsies tomorrow? How many biopsies tomorrow?
I'm sorry. In any case, there could someone who's talking please mute? Thank you. There's databases that have genotype, phenotype connections, things like that. The NLM has also played a role in standardizing and developing terminology so that computers can operate on standardized terminology. And the NLM has also been a leader in funding research and also educational grants, including training grants. And my career, like many informatics leaders in the US, has been greatly facilitated by the NLM. The NLM and the NIH more largely have led development in genomics and bioinformatics. When I was in my early days in the informatics field, the Human Genome Project was just being started, and it took over a decade to sequence the first 2 human genomes. Now, of course, we can sequence genomes a lot easier and a lot more inexpensively. But it was quite an effort. The so-called first draft of the genome was completed in 2003, but there was still about 8% of the genome that was not actually fully sequenced until last year. As you all know, the cost and time of sequencing has dropped dramatically, and this has led to much more understanding of genomic variation and its complexity. Genetics is a lot more complicated than when I learned it as a medical student in the 1980s. And that's led to things like the precision medicine paradigm, particularly prominent in cancer, but starting to emerge in other diseases such as cardiovascular, neurobiology, et cetera, where the diagnosis and treatment is guided by findings in the genome. And there are many resources for genomics that come from the National Center for Biotechnology Information, or NCBI, from the NLM. And there are also others who produce databases of omics data and information. A big turning point in the US was around 2008 to 2010. Early in the 2000s, the first decade of this century, there was growing evidence from research supporting the value of the electronic health record and clinical decision support for improving the quality and safety in healthcare. And it's a bipartisan thing in the United States. So Republican President George Bush mentioned it in his State of the Union address each year from 2004 to 2007. Then in 2008, the US had the Great Recession, and then which coincided with the election of Barack Obama. This led to the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act, which was an economic stimulus of about $780 billion into the US economy from the government. And within that was something very important to medicine and to biomedical and health informatics, which was the allocation of about $30 billion to provide incentives to adopt and so-called meaningfully use electronic health records. And there was other investments as well in health information exchange. So facilitating information moving across different healthcare systems, developing the workforce and doing research. And this really, the US had been somewhat of a laggard compared to a lot of European countries in terms of adopting electronic health records. But you see here what happened. The money was made available, and especially in hospitals. Virtually all hospitals now in the US have an electronic health record. A large proportion of office-based physicians use electronic health records as well. So it's pretty much ubiquitous through the healthcare system in the US for electronic health records. And then, of course, more recently in the informatics field, we have seen the reemergence of AI. The AI winter has now thawed, and the initial type of AI that emerged was predictive AI. That is AI that can classify images into diagnoses, provide physicians advice on making diagnosis or proper treatment. And this new era of AI has been driven by a number of factors. One is advances in the science of machine learning. The machine learning existed in the 20th century, but the data sets were very small. The computers were not very powerful. There wasn't the internet. So clearly machine learning, better ways of classifying images and other kinds of data. There's also just increasing availability of data generally. Most imaging, including medical imaging, has become digital. We have the electronic health records. And of course, we have more powerful computers and networks. So this has led to this resurgence of AI. Probably the most initial successes were with image interpretation, and there are systems now based on machine learning and lots of data that, for example, that work in the image intensive fields like radiology. So machine learning algorithms able to diagnose things like pneumonia and tuberculosis comparably to physicians, retinal images, being able to diagnose diabetic retinopathy, skin lesions for skin cancer, and in pathology, things like breast cancer slides to predict the grade of tumors and so forth. And there's also been achievements in areas beyond imaging, predicting adverse events in hospitals and hospitalizations before they happen. Another interesting application is generating clinical notes from listening in on the conversation when the patient and physician talk with each other. And on the bioinformatics side, there's been huge breakthroughs in predicting protein folding, which was used to be considered the hardest problem in biology, but it's essentially been solved by machine learning. And you can give programs like IBM's AlphaFold, or I'm sorry, Google's AlphaFold, and it will predict the structure of the protein, which is helpful not only for understanding more about diseases, but developing drugs and so forth. Another, to me, fascinating area of AI is being able to see things that humans can't. And I put see in quotes because it's not seeing as if you're looking in your eyes. But some early successes in this area were, for example, taking retinal images and being able to determine a patient's age or their biological sex, doing the same from electrocardiograms. And so there are computer programs that can take pictures of the retina and classify male versus female sex where humans cannot. And more recently, things like chest X-rays, being able to predict cardiac function and valvular heart disease just from plain ordinary chest X-rays, not from angiograms or more advanced studies, even being able to classify diabetes. And we're seeing more and more of this, and it's a very interesting phenomenon. That said, all of these advances are still at a fairly early stage. And just as in medicine, we have basic science that eventually becomes clinical science, we're still in the basic science era of this. So there's a lot of issues. For example, when they've used retinal image scanning for diabetic retinopathy, other issues come into play, like how good of images can you capture? How are images compromised by cataracts and things like that? So we still have a ways to go to implementing this all in the real world. And in fact, the evidence base is pretty modest. There was the most recent systematic review of clinical trials showed that there's only been about, at least as of late 2021, I'm sure the number has increased now, about 40 randomized controlled trials of AI implemented in clinical settings. So there's a ton of these predictive modeling papers. They're all very interesting. They're very promising. But translating that to the real world, we still have a ways to go. I actually tell students in my program, this is where the big opportunity is for AI. And then, of course, in the last 9 or so months, we have this area of so-called generative AI. And probably you all have heard of, many probably using ChatGPT, which was introduced in last November and really upended the whole AI field, because it brought this new type of AI forward, generative AI, where you ask a system for information and it provides that information. And these are based on so-called large language models that are based on a type of technology called transformer models. And they're trained with massive amounts of text from across the internet. And they are quite effective. You may have, even though they're imperfect, and actually they've also been found sometimes to just confabulate about things. But for example, the ChatGPT has received a passing score, and some other large language models beyond ChatGPT on the US medical licensing exam, which all medical students take. In certain board exams in radiology, and my own field of clinical informatics has achieved passing scores. There was a paper looking at clinical cases, the famous clinical cases from New England Journal of Medicine, answering patient questions, found to actually answer them more just as accurately and with more empathy than physicians might answer such questions, and doing tasks like drafting letters to patients. So clearly this technology can do a lot, and it's impacting medicine. I'll come back to some of the limitations as I move into my next question of where has biomedical and health informatics fallen short. Certainly one area is in electronic health records. Even though they're pervasive in the US, physicians have mixed feelings of them. The current systems tend to slow clinicians down. They oftentimes prioritize non-clinical aspects of care. And we have this phenomenon in the US of clinician burnout that electronic health records contribute to. And in essence, one of the challenges is that clinicians, physicians, we want to read and write the patient's story. We want to read about it from others. We want to write it ourselves. Yet, if we really want to do interesting things with using data, we want more structured data for things like decision support and research and so forth. And so there's a little bit of a tension there. We also have systems that don't always communicate well with each other, so we can't readily move information from one, for example, electronic health record to another. There's a lot of effort going on towards standardizing data and making it more interoperable, so data that's used in one system can be used in another. And then we have this growing problem. It's not limited to healthcare, but it's certainly a problem in healthcare around privacy and security. Now that all of our information is online, how do we protect it? How do we keep it secure? How do we make it available to those who need it, but not to others who would abuse it? And there's a lot of challenges with that. And then the question is, what about AI? Is it going to help or hinder medicine? I always like on this slide to put a famous US icon, Dr. McCoy from Star Trek, who I point out, had all that great technology at his disposal, but he still was an empathetic physician. He cared about his patients. And AI will never replace physicians. It will have a big impact in their lives. But as my colleague, Curtis Langlotz, who's a radiologist, says, AI won't replace radiologists, but radiologists who use AI will replace radiologists who don't. And I think that's probably true for all areas of medicine. And we have to address these challenging issues about how AI may compromise care. It may lead us to make decisions too quickly. It may be based on biased data. We're certainly learning more about that in the US and around the world. So it needs to be implemented in responsible and fair ways. And there's a lot of effort going on in that. And then the whole challenge of what to do about medical education, since systems like ChatGPT are so good at answering questions, how do we integrate it for its best value? How do we teach physicians how to best use this technology in the care of patients? So let me also talk some about the people who work in biomedical and health informatics, people who work in the field professionally, those who are leaders, but also everyone else, since informatics impacts everyone, as the title of the talk says. It's an essential discipline for 21st century medicine. So there are a growing cadre, of which I am part of those who work professionally in the field. We overlap, but are distinctive from the pure technology side. So computer science, information technology, health information management. Those are the individuals who historically manage paper medical records, and even this growing field of data science. And so what is it that distinguishes us who work in informatics? One is the application domain expertise. Not everyone who works in informatics needs to be a physician or a nurse or other kind of clinician, but they certainly need to understand the domains of healthcare, of biomedical research, of public health. And again, this focus that is more on information than technology. And we're even starting to see in the US certifications. So just as physicians who work in internal medicine and radiology and other fields are board certified, there is now a subspecialty of clinical informatics, which is a subspecialty of all specialties. So those of us who have a background in internal medicine, that's our primary specialty. But also radiologists, surgeons, pediatricians, family physicians, et cetera. And even outside of medicine, there's a second certification that's emerging in the US called the AMIA, which is the organization Health Informatics Certification for many of the rest of those individuals. So what do those who work in informatics need to know and do? There were some workforce analyses done by AMIA looking at the kinds of expertise. So, and it found that the expertise for health informatics generally and physicians specifically were not that different. Obviously, a foundational knowledge of the field. Looking down at the second one, the clinical informatics subspecialty, so improving care delivery and outcomes, enterprise information systems, including electronic health records. Data governance is a very important area as we amass these large collections of data. How do we use them responsibly? How do we keep them secure? And then leadership, because information systems, especially in complex places like hospitals, are complicated undertakings, and managing change, providing leadership, being professional in their use are all important. And this figure on the right just reiterates the different areas that go into informatics, and it pretty much reiterates what I've been saying before. So many organizations in the US now have informatics leaders. most mid to large size hospitals, even many smaller hospitals, have a chief medical information officer, or CMIO, who is that liaison between the technology people and the clinical people, and they oversee the applications like electronic health records and telehealth systems and knowledge-based knowledge resources, things like that. And there's growing numbers in other areas. So many academic medical centers now have chief research information officers that oversee that intersection between the research systems and the technology people. Nursing, even pharmacy, some of the other areas. And there's also chief data quality or privacy officers. And another interesting phenomenon is that usually the lead technology individual in an organization is the chief information officer, or CIO. Many of those now in healthcare settings are people that come from the informatics side as opposed to the technology side. So many physicians are, a growing number of physicians are chief information officers. But informatics is not just for those who work professionally in the field, it's for everyone. Actually, the Association of American Medical Colleges, AAMC, published a set of learning objectives in 1998 for what medical students should learn in informatics. Of course, this was before the ubiquitous internet and the widespread use of electronic health records, but it started to tackle these issues. But it's actually not just physicians and medical students, it's also patients. This study by Fox is 10 years old. I'm sure the numbers are higher, but a majority, probably now almost everyone, looks online for health information. And 10 years ago, a third of them were attempting to diagnose illness. And now we have tools like ChatGPT that will probably make this even further. So our patient, unlike when I was in medical school where the information was cloistered in the library, our patients have access to pretty much the same information that we do. Even if they're commercial resources that require subscription, they can get access through libraries and things like that. So we no longer control and are the only ones who have access to the information. It's also important for research scientists, so clinical and translational scientists, next generation research scientists, nurses, other healthcare professionals. Everyone now has access to information, and we need to help them use it most effectively. Let me delve a little further into informatics and health professions education. I've had the opportunity at our medical school over the last decade to start to integrate informatics into the medical school curriculum, which actually, of all the curricular efforts I've been involved with, it was much easier to build our graduate program for masters and PhDs than to try to get space in the medical school curriculum. There's the never-ending battle. But anyways, one of the first things we did was develop a set of competencies and you see the list of them on the right. There were initially 13. We added a 14th one in 2020. And actually the 14th one should now actually probably say AI and not machine learning. But these are the kinds of things that the 21st century physician needs to know how to do. Finding knowledge-based information, effectively using the electronic health record, using decision support, population health management, protecting the privacy and security for our patients, improving safety, measuring quality, exchanging information. I won't read through the rest of the list, but this set of competencies has guided the curriculum that our medical students get. And it's not just a single course. They really get bits and pieces of it throughout their medical school path. So my colleague, Charles Safran, back in 2009, noted that informatics training is more important than hardware and software. My colleague Doug Fritzma stating what I've been stating, that informatics is a required skill for 21st century clinicians. There was even a paper just last week in the New England Journal of Medicine by Goodman and colleagues that as we move into this era of clinical algorithms, we need to train physicians how to use them and understand how they work, understand their limitations, and how to apply them effectively. So let me, in my last few slides, talk about opportunities for informatics in Africa. Through my connection with UCT, I've had the opportunity to be involved with and learn a lot about healthcare and informatics in Africa. And I think there's a lot of exciting things happening. My first connection actually to UCT was through Nikki Mulder, who's a faculty at your institution, and probably most of you know, who asked me to serve on the scientific advisory board of H3A BioNet. And H3A BioNet comes from a project that's funded by the US National Institutes of Health. It's kind of winding down now, called Health and Human Heredity in Africa, or H3 Africa. As I've come to learn, and probably you all know much more than me, there's a great deal of genetic diversity in Africa, and there's a lot of opportunity, and including, if it's done right, with African scientists generating the data, managing the data, working with the data, and bringing in colleagues from outside of Africa for expertise when needed. And so there was a bioinformatics support network, which was H3A BioNet. And so I, during the H3 Africa project, served on the scientific advisory board. The new big initiative funded by the NIH in the US is the Data Science Initiative for Africa. And there's initially 20, now they've awarded some additional grants for research, for training, for ethical, legal, and social issues, and a coordinating center, which actually is run now by Nikki at UCT. And one of the projects that was funded that has been funded under DSI Africa is the Computational Omics and Biomedical Informatics Program, or COBIP. And this is the collaboration between our two institutions, and Tanashi Mtsvangwa in biomedical engineering at UCT, and myself are the multi-PIs. Tanashi is the contact PI. And we have this very exciting collaboration. I've actually been in Cape Town 3 times in the last year. Unfortunately, I'm not able to be there today. But what we are doing in this program is developing a new graduate program at UCT, a new master's and PhD programs, and the grant funds the development of it and initially students in the program. And it's a collaboration where some additional expertise can be provided by my institution, Oregon Health and Science University. One of the things that we do is many of our courses are online. And in fact, people take our courses from all over the world. So some of the courses, particularly in clinical informatics and clinical research informatics, that are less developed at UCT, we can bring to the table to participate. And students in these programs will be able to take courses and will be able to develop faculty in these areas, and in the long run, develop these resources in Africa. And of course, I myself have a lot of experience in developing informatics educational programs. So it's been a real delight for me to participate in this collaboration. And I look forward to my next visit to Cape Town, whenever that will be. Well, let me wrap up, and I tried to leave some time for questions and discussion. So what are some of the key challenges ahead for the informatics field? Clearly, we still have a ways to go in improving the usability of information systems in clinical care, especially the electronic health record. We need to find ways to integrate all of this data, not only omics data, but data that comes from mobile devices, from wearables, from the internet, and so forth. How can we leverage that to improve health and improve the delivery of healthcare? How can we learn from all this data while still protecting privacy and security and avoiding bias in the data sets and the algorithms? And then how do we integrate all this new AI technology for healthcare professionals and into practice? So I appreciate the opportunity to talk. I'll stop sharing my slides in a second. I just want to provide my contact information to you. And I've actually put a PDF of these slides with the references on my website, and I'm happy to provide them in other ways so they can be disseminated to you. So I will stop at this point and stop sharing my screen, and would be happy to answer any questions. I'll turn it back to Nidabeko.
Bill, thank you so much. That was a fantastic lecture, very rich and very helpful. I wish I had been able to hear a lecture like this when I was in the early stages of my training. I do have a few questions for you before I open up the floor. And the first one is for young aspiring physicians with an interest in this field of clinical informatics in particular. What would your advice be on a road to training?
Sure. Well, certainly, well, actually, originally there were graduate programs, including the ones at my institution at the master's level. So a common pathway for physicians to get training was to do some advanced training. I actually did many years ago, before the subspecialty existed, a research fellowship, and those opportunities still exist. They're funded in the US by the National Library of Medicine. But now, of course, we have the subspecialty, and we have subspecialty fellowships. I know the physician training system is different in South Africa, but in the US, you graduate medical school, you do a residency, and then if you want to subspecialize, you do a subspecialty fellowship, and you can do that in clinical informatics now. And so that's kind of the sort of maximal training. But for those who want to do others, to learn more about the field, there would hope. I know that medical training is different in South Africa, but hopefully electives in medical school that would enable, and maybe we can even talk about that, being part of this training grant. I would love to share the expertise and things that we've developed. So I would hope there would be a lot of opportunities, and to see informatics grow in South Africa and other places in Africa like it has in the US.
Thanks, Bill. So for parts of the world, including South Africa, where the economies have a number of structural limitations, what would you consider to be the low-hanging fruit and some of the lessons you've learned in pioneering this work that you would say are important advances that can be achieved with minimal investment in this field?
Sure. Well, certainly, most people around the world now have access to the internet. So we have, so certainly being able to access knowledge resources, being able to access some of the research resources. There's also growing courses online. Many of them are free. There are tools in data science, things like that people can use. as I understand it, and I'm trying to learn more, as electronic health records are used increasingly in Africa, there might be opportunities to do things with the data in those systems. And, obviously, those individuals need mentorship. Again, hopefully our collaboration can lead to some of that. I have not met a lot of medical students. I'd love the opportunity to do so, and maybe we can find ways for medical students at UCT to start to learn more about the field and gain knowledge and skills.
Finally, from me, Bill, one of the opportunities that I think exists is the wide-scale use of smart phones in many African countries. And I was just interested to hear, in light of the comments you made around issues of cybersecurity, what you think the role of smartphones may be in clinical informatics going forward.
Yeah, smart forms. So like forms, structure forms.
Phones, telephones,
Yeah.
like your iPhone or.
Phones. I'm
yeah.
sorry. Yeah, well, yeah, certainly. I mean, phones are ubiquitous. I know when I land in Cape Town, my phone works just as well as it does when I'm sitting here in Portland, Oregon. I think there's a lot of applications for phones. I think one of the challenges is, the size of the screen. I think for a full-blown electronic health record where you're entering data, you're viewing data, the phone might be a little too small. But on the other hand, the phones might be effective in allowing data entry, capturing data, using knowledge resources, online textbooks and things like that. So I think there's a lot of opportunities for smartphones, but I still think there's a role for bigger computers, and of course they're all connected. I mean, one of the great thing about phones is that they connect to the same servers that our computers connect to. So we can do different things with different devices.
Thanks, Bill. Graham?
Thanks, Rebecca. Thanks, Bill, for a really great talk. And just to get that historical perspective, and the scope of the talk was great. My question relates to the scale up of electronic medical records in resource limited settings. And clearly you've alluded to that, something that you foresee happening, but it will take resource. And even if it does occur, there's obviously concerns in resource limited settings where you might not have the finances for sufficient IT backup support. And so you put in place an electronic medical record and you're now reliant on that, and there's a glitch, and then your entire medical record is not accessible, or that it creates a huge problem for the health service. And the other concern is just in terms of the confidentiality of data and protecting the privacy of data with hackers out there. And if you don't have the sufficient expertise in terms of protecting data, that you might be in a situation where confidential information is, even with the best intentions, open to people on the internet, etc. And I'm just interested in your thoughts on those two concerns about the scale up of the electronic medical records in resource limited settings. Yeah,
I mean, you're absolutely right, and there's no kind of magical solution to it. When you have complex IT systems, probably all of us, we carry our phones around now. We can kind of manage the IT on our phones. But when you get into hospitals with lots of different people accessing the medical records and wanting to do different things from it, and then the hospital becomes very dependent on it. Most institutions in the US, have kind of disaster planning. And one of the disasters that we face in healthcare now is when the power goes out. There are procedures in place, but, clearly, you may not be able to access information. A lot of places have, on-site backup power that can, at least kind of get access to the data, even if the full, electricity is not restored. So yes, it is definitely a problem. Unfortunately, electronic health records are not cheap. There are systems, there are open source systems, one that's used widely in Africa and other places, one called Open MRS. It's not a full-blown electronic health record system, but it does provide ways to capture and view and analyze data that's collected in healthcare settings, and it has there you can enter data through mobile devices, through smartphones and so forth. But yeah, part of the planning process needs to figure out what resources it takes to keep the system running, the people it takes, the security, and the power and so forth. And then, and again, so there's no easy answer to that. There's also no easy answer to the security thing. It's actually a combination of technology and people. A lot of technology breaches occur because hackers take advantage of things people do, like clicking on a link that exposes the data and things like that. So there needs to be a combination of the technology side of the security and also educating the users of the technology. My institution periodically sends phishing emails, phishing with PHISHING. And when people click on the wrong link, they're informed that they, did something that they're not supposed to do. They're not punished, but they're given the feedback. We need to do a lot more. And of course, the privacy security problem is not limited to medicine. All of our data out there, and that's something we need to be vigilant about. Again, both the technology for security and for the people. But it's a trade-off, and we hope to maximize the benefits while minimizing the risk. But again, there's no simple answers.
Thanks. I mean, just a kind of related question. At a large hospital in the US, just to give us a sense of how many people would be employed to support the electronic medical record, just as a kind of estimate of
Sure. Well, yeah, I can give you the, at my own institution. So we have a medium-sized university hospitals, about 550 beds. We're also an academic medical center with a lot of research and students. Our IT department employs about 200 people who do everything from running the servers to supporting the users, and so forth. And some people think we could probably use more because, for example, sometimes when a new employee starts, it might take weeks, before they get a computer delivered, that is on the network and has all the access. So it takes an infrastructure to, and this is true in all organizations. Actually, healthcare, I don't know what the statistics are now, but we used to lament, whereas like banking, the banking industry spends about 20% of their budget on IT, and that's the computers and the people. It's lower in healthcare. It's more like about, I think, 5 or 6%. But it does take that level of resources to manage, and especially at an academic center where you also have research going on and students and so forth.
Thanks very much.
I'm just going to check if there's one final burning question for Professor Hersh. If not, Bill, it's an absolute pleasure to thank you for what has been a fantastic lecture. I hope that this is the beginning of a wonderful collaboration that builds on the existing successes between you and other colleagues at UCT. And I look forward to taking these conversations with you forward. But thank you very much for a very stimulating lecture.
Yeah, thank you. And I also look forward to working with you all.
Take care.
Okay, take care. Bye-bye.